The damp earth, the wind through the cracks, the smoldering hearth. In the village in late fall, there is no stock. There is only hope that what they pull out of the cellar will last until spring. The medieval peasant does not choose according to taste. He grows what grows in the dirt, what is stored in the pit, what does not rot under the straw. Every root vegetable is a weapon against hunger. These vegetables are not a luxury. It's a meal when there's nothing else. It's something you can eat for a week straight. Something that feeds, heals, saves. In front of you are 10 vegetables on which the life of the whole village was based. Without them, there would be no survival. Without them, there would be no spring. At the bottom of the wooden cellar, between the wet straw and the clay walls, lies she, the turnip. Modest, hard, with a light coating of earth, and it is the backbone of the whole winter. Without it, you can't cook a soup, you can't feed a child, you can't last till spring. In the Middle Ages, turnips were what the potato would later become. A staple root vegetable, a staple of the poor man's diet. It was planted everywhere, in communal fields, in kitchen gardens behind the hut, on slopes where grain would not take root. It grew on damp, heavy soil requiring neither care nor sunshine, only time. It was sown in early summer. Sometimes it was sown again in late August, so that it could be harvested before frost. The whole family harvested the turnips. Men pulled out the roots, women tore off the haulm, children shook off the soil. Turnips were put into baskets, then into holes dug in the ground, covered with moss or straw. There, in the damp darkness, they waited for their time. Root vegetables could be stored for up to 6 months. Even frozen, even cracked, it was still put in a pot. They didn't throw away the shoots. They were sourdough, dried, and added to bread. There was not a single piece that was considered superfluous. They didn't like it, but they respected it. Turnips were heavy, dense, bitter, but boiled with grits, with an onion, with a handful of beans, it became food. Warm, long-lasting, safe, even without salt. In monastic inventories of the 14th century, in chronicles and rent books it is stated, 3 sheaves of turnips for a week, dried haulm for cattle and kitchen, the first root vegetable that does not fail. In Germany, France, Russia, Scandinavia, turnip was included in taxes, in statutes, in recipes of Lenten dishes. It was known by sight and in the fingers. Sometimes it was cut small, dried, and put into sacks. These sacks were carried on their shoulders as a supply for the road. Sometimes it was grated and mixed into flour. Sometimes it was boiled into a decoction to cure colds. In the lean years, they ate raw. In bad years, they ate it rotten. And still it saved, because turnips were. Turnips didn't just feed, it kept hunger from taking root. Flavorless, firm, earthy, it was the truest of foods. Not for feasting, it was for living. And as long as there was a single turnip left in the cellar, there was still hope for the house. The cabin is dark, the fire is barely smoldering. There is only water and coarse grits in the pan. But add a sliced onion and the whole room comes alive with the smell. Sharp, bitter, real. The kind you can smell not only in your nose, but also in your chest and stomach. Onions are not food, it's a support for food. It's a shield for the body. It's what keeps a man cold. The medieval peasant always grew onions, turnips for winter, green for spring. They were planted in early spring and late summer. It sprouted easily on poor, weary soil. It wasn't afraid of frost. It didn't need much sun. It was predictable, faithful. When other vegetables rotted, withered, or froze, onions remained. It was tied in bunches, braided into long plaits, hung under the roof by the hearth, in the hay. It dried, darkened, grew stronger, but did not disappear. It was enough for the whole winter. It was in every pot, in every chowder, on every table. It was added to porridge, to legumes, to sauerkraut, to stewed turnips. Even if there was little food, a piece of onion could change the flavor. It wasn't tasty, but it was edible, and that meant you could live. But the power of the onion wasn't just for eating, it healed. If the chest was squeezed by coughing, onion was cut, grated, applied to the skin. If eyes were inflamed, onion juice was dripped, diluted with water. If the stomach was aching, boiled onions in milk. When toothache, chewed raw. When cattle got sick, onions were put in their fodder or rubbed on the skin. Charlemagne's Capitulari de Villis, 8th century, states that onions are one of the obligatory crops for monastery gardens. In Tacuinum Sanitatis, a medical treatise of the 14th century, onion is recommended as a warming and cleansing agent. In Russian herbalists of the 16th century, it is called decoction from internal rot. The green onion was the first sign of life in spring. When the soil is still cold, when everything around is gray and dead, a green feather stretches out of the ground. It was eaten raw, put on black bread, moistened with vinegar, if there was any. It was the taste of spring, the taste of the living, after months of sour and dry food. And even the smell of onions had a part to play. It was put on the headboard of the sick, hanging by the door, hidden in sacks. It was believed to ward off bad air, protect from plague and evil eye. He never disappeared for a season. It didn't get stale. It wasn't thrown away. Even a rotten bulb was cut, peeled, and used while there was still something left. Onions aren't about flavor or harvest. It's about everyday life. It's about resilience. It's about experience. It was known by sight, by smell, by tear. It was given to a child, put in a traveler's sack, held at the headboard of a dying man. It didn't save you, but it helped you hold on. And so it was in every home, in every winter, in every bowl where the chowder was boiling, too liquid, too bitter, but with onions, and therefore edible, which means warm, which means it's alive. A time when plague walks the roads like the wind, when a cough in the corner can mean death, when bad air is not a metaphor, but a threat. At this time, garlic is not a spice. It is an amulet. The medieval village knew it not from cookbooks, but from the smell that permeated everything. Clothes, food, air. It hung in braids from the ceiling, next to dried fish. Lying in the corner of the kitchen, in a bag of salt. He was held not on the table, but above it, beneath him, around him. Garlic was planted in the fall, when the field is already harvested, when the nights are cold but the ground is still soft. It hibernated in the ground, just as a peasant does in a hut. And in the spring, when everything else was just sprouting, the garlic was already stretching upwards. The first taste of spring was not bread, but the sharp, bitter bite of a green feather. It grew in any soil. It wasn't destroyed by rain. It didn't need warm weather. It was hardy, and that made sense. If it grew, it would have something to face the winter with. In the summer, it was yanked out, dried directly in the sun, on canvases, on the fence, on the roof. Then they tied it into braids, long, twisted, braided. These bundles were hung in the warmest and most ventilated places, over the hearth, under the shed, in the hay. The main thing was to keep them dry. Do not let them rot. It was the best stored of all. It did not mold, did not rot, did not require coolness. It wasn't hidden in the ground. It was kept close, because it was needed every day. It was eaten both raw and dried. It was pounded in mortars, boiled in broth. It was added to porridge, to chowder, to meat if there was any. Even if there's no salt, garlic makes food alive. It's invigorating. It warms you from the inside out. But food was only a small part of it. Garlic was a means of defense, and from disease and from fear. It was put under the pillow of a sick person to draw out bad things. It was rubbed on the chest in case of colds. It was hung around a child's neck if a fever broke out in the village. It was chewed before leaving the house in order not to let the spoil in. It was put in the shoes of a pilgrim going on a long journey. It was mixed into the ashes used to wash a baby. Chronicles of the thorny Sorrentino or 14th centuries, especially monastic medical books, point to garlic as an obligatory part of apothecary and household supplies. Allium adventos pestilentes, garlic for breathing against infection. In boiled wine, against internal cold. In herbalists, it was called sharp root, evil spirit against evil spirits. It was worn as an amulet during the plague, not because it was sure to save, but because nothing else worked. And even though the church sometimes condemned pagan behavior, garlic was hung by the door, put under icons, sewn into the hem. Even after death, he remained close by. It was put in the shroud, in the coffin, in the hands of the deceased, sometimes to ward off evil, sometimes just because it was the last thing that made life real. Garlic wasn't tasty, it was powerful. In a world where smell meant threat, it became the smell of protection. It wasn't loved, but it was kept close. Because in every bundle of garlic, in every bite, in every tart breath, there was a thought. As long as he was around, you were still alive. Meat is rare in winter. It is for gentlemen, for holidays, for the last slaughter. But a peasant's day is long, cold, exhausting. You have to work hard. And if meat doesn't feed, peas do. Beans feed. Beans feed beans. Food without glory, but with power. Legumes are an inconspicuous but crucial part of the diet. They were sown as an obligatory complement to cereals. Peas are ubiquitous. It is unpretentious. Its roots enrich the soil and thus help the next harvest. In most regions of Europe, it was sown in the fields vacated after rye or barley, the second layer of life. It was harvested when the pods began to dry directly on the stem. They were threshed by hand, dried, picked. These grains did not rot, did not worm if they were properly stacked. They were stored in cloth sacks, in birch bark boxes, in barns under the stairs, and they could lie until spring, until the next sowing, and even longer. You don't have to eat a lot of peas. A small bowl is already hearty. They swell in the stomach, take a long time to cook, take a long time to digest. They boiled them in the morning so they'd have food for the evening, sometimes with onions, sometimes with turnips if there were any, often just with water. Add a little lard and it's a feast. Beans came into use later from the southern lands. In the north, it required more sun, but in warm regions, it is found in monastery records as early as the 13th century. In Italy, France, and the Pyrenees, beans were boiled, grinded, dried, and put in bread. It became bean meat, rich, nutritious, versatile. Monastic statutes, such as the Regula Benedicti, prescribed a meatless diet almost all year round. Their peas, beans, lentils, and china are mentioned as the basis of all Lenten meals. Pultes de fabis, purea pesorum, mensa humilis, sed fortis. Simple food, but strong. This food was fed to the monk, the peasant, the traveler, and the pilgrim. In peasant families, peas were a staple for the whole family. It was mashed and given to babies with milk, boiled for dinner for the sick, and added to chowder. Pea dough was rolled into flatbreads and baked on a hot stone. These were hungry flatbreads, the taste of land and labor. Beans were often put into a double pot. Turnips or cabbage were boiled first, and then beans were added to make it more rich. Sometimes beans were dried and ground and added to bread dough, replacing part of the grain. The bread was heavy, dark, dense, but it kept in the stomach longer. Judging by archaeological excavations in the area of medieval villages in Brittany, Lower Saxony, and Novgorod land, the remains of beans and peas are found everywhere, next to hearths, in garbage pits, and in the remains of burnt houses. It was not a choice, it was a necessity. Even the smell was recognizable. The peas, boiled all day, filled the hut with a thick, brackish aroma. It didn't whet the appetite, it soothed it. It was reassuring. So there would be something for supper. It meant that the day had not been wasted. Legumes didn't make food festive. They made it possible. It's not meat, it's not pie, but it's what got you out of bed when there was nothing to eat. It's what was fed with hands rubbed from a hoe. It's what you put in a baby's mouth to keep your stomach from shrinking from emptiness. And as long as there was a handful of beans left in the bag, there was still energy in the house, and that meant hope. When there is no more grain, peas, or greens in the field, the cabbage still stands. Wet from the rains, twisted in on itself, with tight, wet leaves, it holds on. Not for beauty, for resilience. It's not a vegetable, it's a stockpile, an edible shield between winter and death. In a medieval village, cabbage was known from early childhood. It was grown by everyone from monastery gardens to peasant beds. It had no privileges, but it had the most important quality. It could withstand the cold. In early spring, When the ground was just thawing, it was planted. First in seedlings, then in beds. Leafy ones were the first to be planted. They quickly gained weight and were suitable for the first soup. The sprouts lasted longer, the whole season until the cold weather. The stronger the bob, the better it will be remembered in winter. The harvest started late, when the other vegetables were already stacked in the cellar, when the field was empty. Then the knife, dull, slippery with juice, would come in and cut out sprout after sprout. The leaves flew aside. Sometimes they were picked separately, dried, salted. But the main thing was the sprouts. Dense, heavy, crunchy. They were stored in different ways. Some of it was stored in the cellar, wrapped in straw. Some in the cellar suspended from the ceiling by a pokeweed. But the safest was in a barrel. Cut, crushed, salted, sometimes adding berries and dill seeds. They were beaten into the barrel with their feet, with their hands, so that it started juicing. They poured water over it and waited. After a few weeks, it wasn't cabbage anymore. It was sour salvation. It could be stored until spring. It got brighter, more aggressive in flavor, but it didn't rot. And that was the most important thing. She was the first to go into the chowder, with porridge, with peas, with beans, sometimes with lard, more often with onions. On hungry days, with water and salt. It swelled, boiled, stretched with fibers. It was eaten for a long time, hot, steaming. Even if the pot was dirty, even if there was no bread, cabbage was already a meal. Medieval medicine respected cabbage. In treatises of tavernicina for centuries, especially in Tequinum Sanitatis and English leech books, it is mentioned as a cleansing food. Softens the insides, eases breathing, chases away malaise. Sauerkraut was recommended for stomach disorders. Cabbage decoction for inflammations. In case of headache, a compress from a warm leaf. It was not just a vegetable, but a part of the health system. During Lent, cabbage was a salvation. In monasteries, it was used to make white soups, without fat, but with garlic and onions. In villages, it was used to stuff flatbread if there was flour left. In castles, it was boiled with meat if the table allowed it. It transcended classes, everyone knew it. Her scent filled the hut. First raw, then boiled, then sour. Not pleasant, but recognizable. It meant food was on the fire, that there was plenty to pour from, that the stomach wouldn't be empty. And even when everything was eaten, there was still cabbage brine at the bottom of the barrel. They drank it for colds. It was used to wash down bread. They poured it over leftover porridge. It held the strength of the whole winter. And as long as there was at least one barrel of cabbage in the hut, the family knew that it was not the end. It's not yet famine. Cabbage was warm, not in taste, but in meaning. It kept longer than bread, easier than meat, more accessible than grains. And it was a reminder, in a world where everything goes to waste, it stays until the last, until spring, until the new sowing. She was overlooked in the field, not considered the king of the vegetable garden. It grew slowly, deeply, silently, between turnips and parsnips, between greens and cabbage. And yet, by winter, when the house became darker and quieter, it was she, simple, strong carrots, remained in the ground, waiting. Carrots did not come to Europe immediately. Until the 11th and 12th centuries, it was known as a wild, bitter, and tough variety, more like a white root, with a thin skin and little flavor. But gradually, especially through the Arab East and Southern Europe, garden varieties, first yellow then purple, began to spread. Orange carrots are a late New Age invention. In the Middle Ages, its color is earthy, golden, sometimes dark purple, like plum, like ink on faded parchment. Not bright, but noticeable. Not flashy, but lively. It was sown in the deep spring, between the grains, on the edges of the beds. Sometimes it was just scattered. It tolerated the cold, didn't fear dampness, didn't need heat. It was small at first, but persistent. By fall, it grew stronger, thickened, accumulated juice. It did not become sweet in the modern sense, but the bitterness gave way to sweetness. It was partially harvested. The best root crops were used for food, the rest were left in the ground, until winter, until January, until spring. Carrots were stored where they were born, under snow, under a layer of straw, under feet. They were pulled out on the right day, sometimes with a crowbar, sometimes by hand in the frost, cooked in different ways, boiled, with turnips, with beans, with onions, with a handful of grits, grated in chowder as a thickener, as a seasoning, dried in thin strips on canvas, on a stone, by the stove. It was chewed raw, especially by children, especially by old people. When teeth are few and desire for sweetness is many. They added it to milk, a rare luxury if there was any. They pounded it with honey and made a paste, which was kept in a bowl as a medicine, as a treat. In medical treatises of Torsion till now 14th centuries, carrots were noted as a food that warms the insides and cleanses the womb. It was recommended for weakness and exhaustion, especially for women and children. In some monasteries, carrots were grown separately as a tender root. It didn't satiate like legumes. It didn't warm you up like porridge. But it made the body soft. It took away the heaviness. It brought flavor to the world of cabbage, turnips, and onions. Sometimes in the dough, sometimes in the wine, if there was any left. Sometimes in bread, there wasn't a lot of it, but it was different, and it was reliable. They didn't store it in bags. They kept it in the ground, in the cellar, in a box of sand, in the stable, in a tub. The main thing is not to let it dry out. The main thing is not to let it freeze to the point of fragility. And in that winter, when the pot smelled not only sour, but also sweet, that meant there were carrots. So somewhere underfoot, there was still life. Stubborn, rooty, tart, but alive. Carrots in the Middle Ages were not a decoration. They were a reminder that even beneath the snow, something tasty grows, that even in the cold, you can find sweetness, and that not everything that lies silent in the ground is forgotten. Sometimes it's just waiting to be taken out and warmed, and eat it, because winter doesn't last forever. And carrots wait. Before Europe knew the word potato, every pot of winter chowder contained it. Parsnips, an unsightly, pale, slightly curved root that looked like a thick carrot. He was not the hero of the feast, but it appeared in the village bowl more often than bread. Parsnips were the main food of the cold season. It was sown in the spring, in dense, moist soil, where other root crops lacked patience. It didn't ask for heat. It grew quietly. Leaves like dill, root, deeper and deeper into the ground. It didn't shout for itself. It just waited. By fall, it was not yanked out at once. On the contrary, it was left in the ground under the first frost, because with the cold it awoke its sweetness. The juice became softer, the flavor deeper, and everyone who ate it after freezing felt it. It was as if the memory of the sun was hidden in it. Parsnips were stored simply, not in a barn, not in hangars, not in a sack. It was in the ground. It didn't need to be dug up in the fall. It lay in the bed, as a hiding place, as a reserve, sometimes until February, sometimes until spring, when everything else had rotted or been eaten. If it was dug up, it was placed in pits covered with straw, or they put sand over it in tubs, or just kept in barns under clay roofs. It didn't spoil, it didn't blacken, it didn't mold, it waited. They cooked it slowly, boiled, with onions, with cabbage, with a handful of grits. Baked in ashes, boiled into mashed potatoes. You could grind it, dry it, roast it on a stone. Sometimes it was mixed with honey, if there was any, and the result was a sweet porridge which was given to old people and children. It was not only satiating, but also strengthening. Medical treatises of the 13th and 14th centuries, especially French and English, recommended parsnips for exhaustion, weakness, moping, and stomach colds. In monasteries, it was prepared as food for convalescents. It was eaten by monks, warriors after a campaign, women after childbirth. It gave strength back. It tasted heavy, with a honeyed note and a bitterness of earth. Not a celebration, but not a punishment either. Parsnips gave the sensation of food, even if there wasn't much of it. Even if boiled in water and salt, it filled, lingered in the body, warmed the stomach. It didn't feed the tongue, it fed the blood. In a peasant family, parsnips were a staple. It was eaten more often than meat, more often than bread. It didn't require flour. It didn't depend on the grain harvest. It just was. anytime, in every home. As long as it stayed in the cellar or in the ground, the family was still warm. Sometimes they put it on a stone by the hearth. Baked it smelled so cozy that it made the house cozy for a moment. Sometimes they rubbed it and spread it on bread. Sometimes they just ate it raw, on the road, in the field, in the barn. He was part of winter, and when the sound of a knife cutting through an old parsnip root was heard for the first time in a year, it meant winter was serious. And that meant it was time to take out the stock and cook and live. Pasternak wasn't about taste. He was about reliability, patience. It was about warmth, gained not by fire but by time. It was in the bowl of the youngest, in the old man's hand, in a shepherd's bag, in a monk's barrel. It was what was left when everything else was gone. And as long as there were parsnips in the ground, there was a winter in the house to endure. It has no ring to it, no flavor, no respect. But when there are no turnips or parsnips left in the cellar, when the cabbage barrel is empty and only water boils in the pot, the peasant reaches for it, to the gray, heavy, uneven rutabaga. No complaints, no words, because it is there. The rutabaga is not a gift, but a compromise. Not a miracle, but the result of a mistake, luck, necessity. Scientists would later call it a hybrid of cabbage and turnip. But in the villages of Europe, in the 14-hour signs or 15th centuries, it was called simply dark turnip, earth root, bitter cabbage. It was born not in the south, not in gardens, but in the north, in the cold, in the damp, in the harsh land. It appeared in culture closer to the 14th century, although wild forms were found even earlier. It took root particularly well in Norway, Sweden, northern Germany, Prussia, Scotland, and Russia. It was sown late. It wasn't afraid of frost. It didn't crack in the rain. It didn't turn black at the root. The root was huge, tight, covered with a grayish-purple rind, as if someone had forgotten it and buried it forever. But that was its strength. It held on the longest. As it was pulled from the ground, my hands felt its weight. Not softness, hardness. Not the smell, the moisture. It was a root vegetable that didn't promise flavor. It promised mass, and there was plenty of it. Stored simply, in pits, in cellars, in piles. It was not afraid of mold, rodents, or frost. Sometimes a whole heap of old rutabaga was found in early spring, and it was still usable. It was washed, trimmed, and put back into the boiler. It was cooked as roughly as it was dug up, cut into chunks, boiled for a long time, pounded, grated, stewed. It was mixed with cabbage if there was any left, with kvass if there was any, bran to make it thick, with fat if it was a holiday, but more often just in water, with salt or without. The flavor is rough, pungent, tart. After long boiling, it became softer, with a distant sweetness, not satisfying, but satiating. Poured into a bowl, it weighed down the body, filled the stomach. And in that winter, when even turnips failed, rutabaga became the main thing. It was considered the food of the poor and the cattle. It was often given to the cows first, but when supplies ran low, it went on the table, and no one was ashamed, because to eat it was to live. In historical documents of the late Middle Ages, especially in Northern and Eastern Europe, rutabaga is mentioned in crop records, tax lists, monastery refectory books, Ruben für das gemeine Essen, rutabaga for winter in the huts. Food is long, ugly, but sufficient. In Poland and Livonia, it was called spare bread. In Russia, it was simply bitter root. Sometimes it was boiled with other vegetables to smooth out the flavor. Sometimes it was baked in ashes. Sometimes just eaten raw, bitten like a pokeweed, because it didn't require processing. It required patience. During the famine years, rutabaga saved villages. It wasn't sung about, it wasn't praised. But there were years when everyone ate only rutabaga and lived to tell the tale. And when a new sprout appeared in the field in spring, the smell of rutabaga was still in your hands. And the feeling that you didn't like it, but you were grateful. The rutabaga isn't about flavor, it's about endurance. It's about the tight, heavy strength that lies in a hole under the snow and waits. It comes into the food when everything else is gone and says, I'm not tasty, but I'm here. Her color then was a dark, almost charcoal purple. She didn't shine in the sun like the modern varieties, but there was a dense, heavy strength inside her, a strength that could withstand dampness, cold, pits, mold, and still be edible. Beets are not a whim. Beets are endurance in its purest form. In the beginning, only its leaves were eaten. It is the beet haulm that has been known to Europe as a vegetable since antiquity. In the Middle Ages, it was grown in monastery gardens under the name beta. It was one of the first green leaves to appear in spring. When cabbages had not yet sprouted, when onions were just sprouting, the beet haulm was already there. It was torn, dried, put into chowder, pounded into porridge. Sometimes it was scalded and wrapped in flatbread like a cabbage leaf. Later, by the 13th centuries, they began to use the root vegetable. At that time it was thinner, oblong, hard, with a faint sweetness. It was not baked or roasted as it is now. It was boiled, crushed, dried. It didn't melt into porridge, it held its shape. And it made the food thicker, darker, fuller. Picked beets late, digging deep, rooted with the remains of leaves. They dried them, scraped off the soil, put them in tubs, baskets, pits, sometimes covered with sand. Sometimes they just put it in canvas bags and put it in the darkest corner of the cellar. And it lay there until spring, until disaster, until need. On a hungry day, beets became the basis of a soup. In boiling water, we put dried haulm, a piece of turnip, some onion, and a piece of beet, sometimes whole, sometimes grated. It gave off color, density, a faint sweetness. And the chowder, though lean, became a meal that could be eaten in silence and feel satiated. If there was cereal, beets were grated into it. If there was milk, boiled with it. If there was leftover flour, they added it to the dough to make the bread wetter. It helped everything. It strengthened, consolidated it. Even if food was scarce, it made it more plentiful. In medical compendiums of the 14th century, including the Taquinum Sanitatis and Herbalists of English and German monasteries, beets are mentioned as a warming food, improving the blood, and gently cleansing the body. It was recommended for constipation, weakness, fever. Boiled haulm was used externally for ulcers and boils. It was food and medicine at the same time. Beet decoction was drunk by the sick, not because it helped, but because it was warm, red, real. Sometimes it was the only thing left in the house. They drank it hot, with a drop of vinegar, with a handful of salt. It was warming, though not satiating. Peasants, monks, and travelers had beets. Everyone knew it. It grew everywhere. And no one praised its taste, but everyone kept it because it didn't rot. It didn't dry out. It didn't spoil in the first place. In the long spring, when there was only kvass left in the barrel, when wet kindling smoldered in the stove, the beets remained in the basket. And it was it that was put in the last pot before sowing. Not because they wanted to, because they had to hold out. Beets aren't about flavor, it's patience. They didn't grace the table, but it was always there. And as long as its root was in the cellar, as long as the dried haulm was not finished in a canvas bag, the house remained warm. It was weak, but its own. And sometimes it was enough to get through another day and to welcome the spring. In the Middle Ages, there was no choice. Only the land, only the season, only what grows when and what can be preserved. Every root vegetable, every haulm, every dried handful was not a garnish, but a matter of life. These 10 simple plants didn't just feed, they kept the village going in the darkest month. They did not decorate the table, but they saved from hunger, from cold, from despair. They were not praised, but without them, there would be no next morning, no next spring. And if you're interested in the real story of survival, where food is a daily effort, where eating is a struggle and harvesting is a matter of life and death, subscribe to our channel. We are not talking about myths here. We are talking about how Europe really lived in the centuries when bread was more valuable than gold and a cabbage was like a week's lunch. Press the bell and let's go back to the past, where every plant was known by touch and cherished like life.